Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to our first sort of event in the South Asia Economics Conference that India Soc and PAC are kind of hosting together. We've kind of decided to get in touch with a lot of highly esteemed, successful academics and really get their perspectives on what kind of the next steps and exciting things are for the countries in the region and what as students we should be looking towards. And speaking on that note, we have Aravand with us today as well. He has a very, very celebrated and decorated portfolio of jobs and things he's done. He's been the chief economist for the Asian Development Bank. He's held roles within the World Bank, IMF, the World Trade Organization, been part of a think tank in India. So has a lot of kind of experience all over the place. And I know he's going to be talking about his book today with us, The Emerging Giant, which has been kind of defined by people as a definitive kind of book on the Indian economy. And I think on that note, I'd like to kind of pass over to him and Priyanka to go over kind of his initial thoughts around it. And I know Priyanka has some questions as well. And if you do have any questions, I think the way we'd like to do is maybe towards the end of the session, after the first 20-25 minutes, we'll cater to the questions. You can raise your hand, or because we have a smaller audience, even unmute and ask a question in that way. But yeah, over to both of you.
Yeah, so first we just start with some initial remarks, and Mr. Panagariya can talk about himself and introduce his career and his book.
Okay, I think, no need for me to introduce myself. Anybody interested can look it up. Information on professors, at least in the United States, and I think as also in UK, it's public, so it's available. The book you mentioned, India, the Emerging Giant, is an old one that was actually published in 2008. Since then, I've done 3 other books, and that's not the one. India, the Emerging Giant is 10 years old. What I'm going to talk about is the book which I did very recently and has just come out about 2 or 3 months ago, called New India: Reclaiming the Lost Glory. Since there's so few of you, I'm not sure how you want to run it, but anyway, let's see where it goes. So this book has the title New India: Reclaiming the Lost Glory. And you can see the cover perhaps in the back here. First, the title, what is the lost glory? So if you go back in history, and Angus Maddison has put together the historical data going all the way back to 2000 years ago. These are all guesses based on some information, of course. But that's those are the estimates to which we refer. Those are the only estimates that we have going that far back for the global economy. In the first millennium, India was almost about 30% of the global GDP. And when we talk in India about, everywhere about the wonder that was India, or Sonic Italia and whatever, that's the sort of picture. And so it was the largest economy globally. In the second millennium, it share declined, but remained quite large until as late as 1700. It accounted for 20% of the global GDP. Even till 1820, by which time the British East India Company was already there and pretty much controlling more than half of India. India was still 16% of the global GDP. The real decline then began to happen, and both there are, in terms of the share, there are 2 things happening. India itself was either not doing very well or even declining, depending on what estimates you use. But at the same time, of course, the Industrial Revolution happened and it bypassed India completely. But during the Industrial Revolution, of course, the incomes in other parts of the world, largely the United States and Europe, rose very, very rapidly, at least in relative terms. And so that, of course, by the time India became independent, it was left to maybe about 3%, 4% of the GDP, of the global GDP. And India itself actually did not do too well in the first 3 to 4 decades. And even relative to the faster growth in the rest of the global economy. As a result, the share in the global GDP continued to decline. So that is the kind of reclaiming of the lost glory, the glory that had been lost. What do we do? How do you go about reclaiming it? And then the main title, New India. Now, those of you who have read, some of the historians would know that the names of the early leadership, Jawaharlal Nehru, Patel, and so forth, are associated more with as the makers of modern India. Now, the making of India really post-independence was on 2 tracks. One was the political and the other was the economic. So there was a political project to build democracy, and there was the economic project to eradicate poverty. The political project was very successful, and India has emerged as not only the largest democracy, but a very, very robust one at that, and has sustained. It's one of the handful of 3 or 4 countries around the world which since the Second World War or since the independence within the developing world have remained democratic. You got that tiny period of emergency when you can argue about it, but that's really a blip, and largely so it is 70 years of continuous, 70 plus years of continuous record of democracy. So that project was very successful, but the making of modern India on the economic side did not happen. And so I use a different term for what I call New India, which we track back to, I sort of say the turning point really for it is 1991. And if I were to name 2 or 3 makers of New India, those would be Narasimha Rao of the Congress, Atal Bihari Vajpayee of the BJP, and Narendra Modi of the BJP as well. So that is what the New India title is about. Now, just very quickly to set the stage for the economic side, which is, I'm an economist, so that's what the talk is really is going to be about. So if you look back, where the failure of the economic project initially, if you index the per capita income, and you can think of it as per capita income per week or what have you, but I'm just going to index it. So it's suppose, in 1950, 51, it was 100. By the time you come to about 1980, you got to 150. 30 years, you've just gone to 1.5 times to where you started. It's pretty much lost. 3 decades have been lost practically, when you look at the economic progress. And of course, since India started incredibly poor, going from 100 to 150 really didn't make a big dent. And so the poverty, the abject poverty, more or less remained. We could say maybe a tiny bit movement, but hardly. 1980s, you did a little better. So another 10 years later, you were at by 1990, you were at about 210 or so. So a little better. But even if you take that 40-year period, from 1950 to 1990, you're still at 210, barely twice, 2.1 times of where you started. If you bring it then to 2020, you are somewhere around about 850. So then from 1990, you go roughly 4 times. And that's a period of 30 years. And that is the sort of, New India begins to emerge. India has not grown as rapidly as some of the East Asian economies did during their rapid growth periods. So, if you look at South Korea, for instance, 1963 is the turning point for South Korea. And South Korea really grows at about between 9 and 10% for about 3 decades. And at that, it is fully transformed. And today, per capita incomes in South Korea are probably more than 10 times of what they are in India. China was the other large economy, population-wise, not economic size-wise, but population-wise. It also did very poorly, at least till 1980. It also followed, effectively both India and China followed very socialist set of policies. Most of the leadership in India had been actually educated in your country with Harold Lasky and so forth. So very, very socialist mindset. And under Nehru, it was socialism light, but under his daughter Indira Gandhi, it really became very hard socialism, and that's when a lot of the bad policies really got put into place, which the subsequent leaders, starting from 1991 onwards, are still trying to dismantle. Not everything has been dismantled, but quite a bit has been, and good progress has happened as a result. And so this is where I mentioned that you've gone from 1990 to 2020. In 30 years, you've gone about four times. Growth in India, particularly, the really faster growth began around 2003, and the subsequent 17 years, if you take alone, it grew at about, on average, 7.4%. So it's not 9-10, but it's only a couple of percentage points away from that mark. That 17-year period really is about the fastest that at least any democracy has grown on a sustained basis. And I think we'll see this continue to happen. Now, economic transformation, you can take virtually any country which is today, high per capita income country, any country which has per capita incomes of $10,000 or more, which will include then China into that category. Ultimately, this has been done by having the population, the workforce, move out of agriculture into industry and services. There is no example, whether you look at the industrialized countries, so Europe and the United States, or you take those largely in Asia that have transformed themselves. You can leave aside the oil exporting countries. So, that's the per capita income is coming from the oil price. So that really is not truly a transformation of the population. But countries that have actually transformed through growth has always been, agricultural population, agricultural workforce moving into industry and services. And that is a process which, as an example, South Korea in 1965, roughly, 65% of the workforce was in agriculture. And by the early 1990s, it had dropped below 20%. Today, it's about 5%. So, pretty much South Korean workforce depends now largely on industry and services. China, likewise, I don't know the exact numbers, but they're certainly well below 30% in agriculture now. In India, this transformation, this movement of the workforce out of agriculture into industry and services has been very slow. There has been movement, the share of agriculture has declined, but that decline has been very slow. GDP share has fallen. GDP share is now about 15% or so of agriculture in the entire GDP. But the workforce, roughly 42% of the workforce of India still remains in agriculture. And that's a very large workforce. Now, on top of that, that's a 42% of a very large number. The total workforce in India is something of the order of 500 million. So it's a very large number of people dependent on agriculture. And that has, of course, also meant that the holdings, agricultural holdings, are incredibly small in India. So there are about 70 million agricultural holdings that are less than half hectare in size. And the average, so every one of these 70 million, which is about 48% of all agricultural holdings, right? So 48% of all agricultural holdings, which amount to about 70 million, are less than half hectare, every one of them. And the average size of those holdings is less than a quarter hectare. Now that's a very tiny, nobody can make a living for 3 or 4 people. And average size of the family in India tends to be about 5 or so. Nobody can make a living on that. There are simply too many in agriculture still. That is the key sort of challenge of poverty removal in India still today. And really, we have to talk in terms of bringing prosperity, not just the elimination of abject poverty. And that is the challenge that continues. So that's the first part of the problem, that first part of the obstacle India needs to overcome. And now remember, even if we say that we'll double farmers' income, as Prime Minister Modi says, it's doubling from a very low level. So whereas it is a huge relief, no doubt, anybody who is dirt poor, doubling the income is a big deal for them. But at the same time, it's not something that will bring prosperity to them. The per capita income in agriculture is simply too low. If you look at output per worker, the value output, so value added per worker in agriculture, compare it to industry and services. So industry output per worker is more than 5 times what it is in agriculture. In services, it's more than 4 times what it is in agriculture. So you can see not only the fact that the level is low, but the difference is large also between industry and services. And industry and services output itself per worker is by no means huge. So that gives you an idea of, this is how ultimately the per capita income is about $2,200, $300 per year in India, which is about 1/5 of what it is in China. So that is your big challenge. So therefore, really the challenge becomes creating jobs in industry and services, which would attract the workers in agriculture to come to industry and services. That's an ongoing process. You must have seen how many migrant workers actually showed up during this COVID crisis. So that is a good illustration of the process being underway. But still, compared to the overall workforce of the country, size of the workforce, that migrant force is not large enough. Actually, one needs a lot more workers to migrate out of agriculture into industry and services. And that's the only way you are really significantly going to raise even agricultural output per worker, because right now the land holdings being so small, there's not enough of a land holding per worker. So if you really take out about half of this workforce out of agriculture over the about 15 years time, that would immediately raise land per worker in agriculture also. So the agricultural output itself will rise. But more importantly, you need to create jobs in industry and services. Now, India's problem is that of smallness. India is a country of very, very small, tiny economic units. I already described to you the agricultural scene. industry turns out to be no different. So 42% of the workforce, I already told you, is in agriculture. A little more than 42, 42.5%. Another 44.5% of the workforce, of the total workforce of India, is in these enterprises which have less than 20 workers. All right. So these are tiny little enterprises. More, about half of those are actually self-employment. It's not even, you know, employment in terms of wage employment. It's basically mom and pop operations where the family is, you know, doing some economic activity to make its ends meet. Largely self-employed, not industrial kind of employment. And only about 10% of the workforce is in these enterprises which have 20 or more workers. Now 20 is by no means large, you know, it's still, even if we use the general, the common sort of standard classification of the enterprises, anything that's less than 50 workers is classified as small enterprises. Anything from 50 to 199, so 50 to less than 200 is medium size, and 200 or more is what we call large enterprises. So you can see that, you know, even this 10% that we have figures for is in 20 or more. So if you really limit yourself to 200 or more, it's not even 5%. That's where the productivity really begins to cut. I mean, that's where the, you know, the output per worker begins to really be significantly higher. Now, what also happens is that when such a large part of your workforce is only in small and such a tiny kind of proportion is in large enterprises, that then also translates in the ecosystem itself being defined by these small little enterprises as opposed to the large enterprises. And contrast that with the Chinese situation, right? That's a country for which we have good numbers. And if you compare, so in India, you see about this, 85%, right? 86% of the workforce, including agricultural industry, is in tiny little enterprises or agriculture. So that's the whole ecosystem. Even in manufacturing, if you take separately, about 85% of the workforce within manufacturing is in enterprises that are small, micro, tiny, small, less than 50 workers. China, much less, you know, ours, India's 85%, China about less than 25%. About 50% in China are in large enterprises, 25% in medium. And now what happens is that when you got these productive firms, which are employing about almost 75% of the workforce, medium plus large, these are the companies that define the ecosystem. And that also actually tightens the labor market for the small firms. And that forces the small firms to also improve their efficiencies, because they've got to, you know, workers got options in working in medium and large firms, where they can pay better wages. So that really forces smaller firms to become super efficient as well. So if you look at the productivity differences, in China, the small firms have a productivity of about 60% of what it is in the large firms. In India, just 20%. The small firms have a productivity of only 20% of what it is in the large firms. And of course, productivity in Indian large firms is much smaller than productivity in Chinese large firms. But even if we compare Indian productivity to the Indian productivity between small and large, the small ones have only 20% of the productivity of the large firms. China, about 60%. Now, what you end up with this is that not only productivity in these small firms is low, but that's where almost all the workforce is sitting. In manufacturing, as I said, 85% of the workforce is sitting in enterprises that are less than 50. workers. And the productivity is less than 20% or about 20% of what it is in the large enterprises. So the challenge of India today, and that's the ultimate theme of the book, New India, is to change the ecosystem in a way that large and medium firms emerge in much larger numbers than is the case currently. And that is a dual challenge. Part of it is the size challenge of the firm, but the other part of it is that whatever large firms India has are all in highly capital intensive or skill intensive sectors. What are India's successful sectors? These are pharmaceuticals, petroleum refining, information technology, financial sector, and you got maybe automobile, right? These are all highly capital intensive or skilled labor intensive sectors. They don't employ in large numbers. Well, first of all, they don't employ workers in large numbers. And second, they certainly do not employ workers with relatively limited skills in large numbers. Every single country, starting from South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, China, you name it, whatever countries that have done well and transformed themselves within a short period have done so initially by very rapid capture by them of the global markets in labor intensive products. What are these products? Apparel, footwear, and furniture, all sorts of kitchenware, everyday needs, stationery, what you have, all the labor intensive products, all the products that we use in daily life. This is what they really, because what happens is that these products require limited capital, and the employment per unit of capital is much larger in these sectors than it is in something like petroleum refining or in automobile. You make a very large investment and very few workers are employed per unit of capital. What India has ended up doing is actually, first of all, being still a relatively low per capita income country. Savings rate itself is not huge, certainly not compared to China. It's a decent savings rate of about 28, 29% currently. But total amount of capital that those savings generate is still small. And if you then take it and put it largely into these very heavily capital intensive sectors, labor intensive sectors, particularly for the larger firms, which do use some capital, they're far less capital intensive than the others, but they still use some capital. They are starved of capital largely. And so, the medium and large enterprises in these sectors, in fact, are very limited. As a result, India has not been very successful in these sectors. India's exports in apparel, for example, are today less than 20 billion. China at peak was exporting $180 billion. Even today, Chinese exports of apparel are about 150 billion. A lot smaller countries, Vietnam, which is only 90 million people, exports more apparel than India does in absolute terms. Bangladesh also exports more apparel than India does. And footwear, of course, China still is exporting almost $40 to $50 billion worth. That's where the ultimate problem is. And that's where a lot of economic reforms are required. India has been slow, actually, to do the kinds of reforms that were essential to kickstart the labor-intensive sectors. Quite a few of those have happened now. There's still labor laws were the particularly serious kind of hindrance to this. Historically, of course, India had that baggage coming all the way up to 2005, 2006 of what we call small scale industries reservation. India was a unique country, which took out some 800 or so, meaning practically all labor intensive products, you name it, anything that was labor intensive basically was reserved for the manufacture by small enterprises. These were tiny, small enterprises. If you go back into history, cottage industry is what we used to talk about. Cottage industry, that's where the workers got dumped, in these very low productivity cottage industry employments. And that sort of continued, that reservation continued till almost 2005. So historically, in these sectors, firms have been small. Even the entrepreneurs are hardwired to go with small scale here in these sectors. And all India's successful entrepreneurs had been told that, these are not open to you. You are not supposed to, these are small scale. So all large, if you look at the Tatas and the Birlas and the Ambanis and Reliance, that, all of them are in the highly capital intensive or skill labor intensive industries. They have no interest in investing in these labor intensive products, which will create the jobs for the masses. So even the mindset sort of today, hardwiring of the mindset of the entrepreneurs is, it's not on their radar screen, to build these large factories or what China, that you see in China. You go to China, you got an entire town which just produces buttons or threads. So and the firms are large. The apparel firms sometimes would be more than 100,000 workers under a single roof. That's a scale, and that's the sort of thing. Even Bangladesh, has much larger apparel firms than India does, and they are therefore more successful in the export markets. So small scale industries, reservation is now gone, but still labor laws largely, 90% we are there. Very recently, the Modi government replaced the old some 30 labor laws, which were highly fragmented, which were fragmenting the labor markets in an incredibly bad way, have been replaced by 4 new labor codes. But there is one provision still which needs to be modified. They have given, rather than do it themselves from the central government, they have, passed it on to the states really. But that provision is that any company which has more than 300 workers, 300 or more workers, does not have the right to hire and fire workers. I mean, it has the right to hire, but it doesn't have the right to fire. Meaning, so if your demand declines, or if for some reason you become unprofitable and you have to lay off the workers, if you are a company with more than 300 workers, you are not allowed to do that. It's simply not permitted. And that, of course, is a problem. Then the enterprises don't want to become large. And if you're not large, you are not going to export. So you're in that catch-22 situation still remaining. What the central law says is that the state governments can change that law, raise that limit through notification. No legislation is required. But so far, I don't think any state has come forward. But anyway, this was only in September 2020. So hopefully some progressive states will come forward and change that limit as well, and allow large firms to emerge more freely. So that I think is what is required. A lot of the book now, New India, is about laying down the set of reforms that are required to facilitate the emergence of these larger firms in these labor-intensive sectors. So I think let me leave it there. If you have questions, we'll take them up from here on. I've not talked about any of the reforms, which is what really the bulk of the book, 2/3 of the book is about. So first 1/3 of the book really talks about this issue of what India needs to do, meaning why it needs labor-intensive sectors and why it needs medium and large firms to emerge. It makes that case why it also needs a manufacturing-fed, export-led growth. That also is discussed, so issues of, whether given the kind of automation that exists today or that we are heading towards, or given protectionism that's rising in the global markets, is the export-led growth still feasible? I'm not explained to you that. If you want, I'll take that up in the Q&A, but that's the first 1/3 of the book. The remaining 2/3 is about how to do it. What are the reforms that India needs? So let's stop there. I took you a little bit longer, but you are only 5, 6, 7 students here, so I'll address your questions.
Okay, thank you so much for the talk about how India should start moving away from smaller enterprises to larger enterprises. The first question would be, what do you think the government should implement, or what type of reform should they implement to sort of fast track this transition from agriculture and smaller industrial enterprises to start moving towards the service sector?
Yeah, that's the rest of the 2/3 of the book. So I'll have to sort of, try to give you some 3-4 minute version of that. So one, I have already mentioned that, at least some states need to come forward and raise that limit on firms with the right to terminate workers. Most of the world actually allows that, and certainly Chinese labor markets are extremely flexible. So that flexibility needs to be given to the enterprises. That's one. But then India also needs a change of mindset on trade policy. Now, a lot of, the post-1991 reforms liberalized the economy, quite radically, I should say, because, India was so controlled. Everything was required an import license to import. On top of that, the average tariff rates were something over 150% on average. Highest tariff rate was 355%. This is 1991. So from that, we have come a long way. All licensing, import licensing, everything, it's gone completely. Average tariffs are today down to maybe 11-12%. But still, some of the areas, even textiles and clothing, are subject to tariffs of 25%. Automobiles are subject to, auto imports. Automobile imports are subject to almost 125% custom duty. But I think even more disconcerting is the fact that while the present Modi government has done large number of reforms, some incredibly tough reforms, which none of the previous governments even dared touch. Things like insolvency and bankruptcy code, which is today the absolutely modern bankruptcy law, which India badly needed. Goods and services tax. So, a single indirect tax on any given product nationwide. So complete cleanup of indirect tax system, which, easily more than a dozen indirect taxes used to exist. Then reduction in the corporate profit tax. In a country with such a strong socialist past, they have brought it down to 17% for all new manufacturing investments and 25% for everybody else, and cleaned up all the exemptions out of it. The recent farm laws, you can come back to talk about those on agriculture, labor law reform. So very large number of reforms and massive digitization of the economy, very, very important also from the future productivity viewpoint. So a lot of very good things have happened. But on trade, somehow the Modi government has turned protectionist. Meaning, I would say, but it has been gradually raising these tariffs, and clearly with the view to do import substitution, which is a failed model. No country has succeeded to produce 8 to 10% growth rates by pursuing import substitution. I think that's something that we need to get out of if we are going to really speed up this transformation. I think some speeding up will happen. I'm very upbeat that post-COVID decades, India would grow about 8% is my prediction, which is not pie in the sky, because if you take, as I mentioned, average growth rate from 2003 to 2019 or 2004 to 1920 has been 7.4%. So with all the other reforms that have been done, which are relatively recent, none of this has had any serious economic impact yet. That is yet to come. So a lot of the return on these reforms is yet to come. So 8%, I think, is very much within India's reach. But India needs to go 10%. And that's where this opening up of the economy is very important. So then there is a set of things you need to do to the cities, urban. You see, what happens is if you're talking about workers migrating, they need low rent housing. And much of in the emphasis of India's housing policy has been to give give houses to the urban people who are already there. And so the investment has been in ownership of houses. For migrants, that's not, they can't, there is no way they can own a house for the migrant. Initially migrants come in, they look for a place to live, just where they can basically stay, do their chores and go back to work. I mean, migrants basically come to work, earn as much income as possible in a short period of time. So you need dormitory type of housing for the workers. Low rent, basic needs satisfied, and they go and work. So that's what, so the cities basically, land is incredibly expensive in India. Those, and that's because of the laws, bad laws. You don't allow conversion easily of the agricultural land into non-agricultural land. Now, you don't have to do all of it. All you have to do is on the periphery of the cities, as cities expand, because more people come in, you need to be able to convert that that land from agricultural use to non-agricultural use. Leave it to the farmer. The farmer says, I'm not going to sell it, that's fine. But those who are willing to sell because they get a very good price for land, for the land that has been converted for non-agricultural use, they'll get excellent price. So if they want to sell, then allow them to sell. So again, so urban, that's very important. Higher education system in India, that is still being governed by the same laws that India inherited more or less from the British, or basically modeled itself on the British model at that time. 1950s, the University Grants Commission, and the UK also used to have a University Grants Commission, but UK reformed its education system big time, starting in the second half of the 1980s, and it's continued to do that. And now you have a different latest policy that you have, which is roughly what I have recommended, that India should more or less adapt that to the Indian conditions largely. But the higher education system is another area where big reforms are required. Number of these other areas, but for core of the reforms have to be now, given that large number of them have been done now, core of this is opening up and facilitating. Therefore, also I've talked about creating these Shenzhen in Shenzhen in China. Look at it, it's a fantastic transformation in less than 30 years time. 1980, you look at pictures of Shenzhen. If you go to the internet, you'll see they're all a bunch of fishing villages, a population of 300,000. Today, one of the most vibrant urban spots on the face of the earth. And that's because they let the foreign investors, all kinds of investments come in there, flexible labor markets, very much free flowing, very capitalist actually, Deng Xiaoping's thinking. I mean, basically, he looked at Hong Kong and he looked at Taiwan across from China and said, what are they doing right and what are we doing wrong? And he basically, that's what India also needs to do. Create these 4 to 6 zones closer to the ports. You got good ports in Gujarat, you got good ports in Andhra Pradesh, you got good ports in Orissa, Maharashtra, fantastic ports. You create the similar pockets of 300 to 500 square kilometers where free flowing kind of rules of game can give the local authorities the powers to make their own labor laws, make their own land laws, which is what Shenzhen and many of these other cities in China have. Do that, let the investors come in, make the movement of goods, exports and imports easy, so that quickly inputs can be brought in, processed, exported back. That's what Shenzhen did really in its early years. Now, of course, it's a much different, per capita income is $25,000 in Shenzhen today. The total population is something like 12, 13 million from 300,000. So it really is a true model. I mean, that's what India ought to emulate. So that's roughly the answer.
Thank you for giving the answer about potential economic reforms for India. We have a question from the audience. So Siddharth can just unmute himself.
Perfect. Thank you so much for this talk. So the Niti Aayog, which you were the first vice chairman of, was sort of created to sort of get rid of the inefficiencies of the planning commission of sorts. Do you think the Niti Aayog's mission of competitive or sort of cooperative federalism has actually come to fruition after you sort of left the post?
What do you mean? Come to fruition while I was there?
Yeah, so after that as well.
Why did it come to fruition only after I left?
Like, yeah. So do you think the vision has also sort of continued past that?
Yeah, no, India is very complicated. Indian federation is very complicated, and this tension kind of is always there, and depending on the particular government of the day, you may get greater or lesser devolution. But you see, I mean, this is my own thinking has also evolved a bit, particularly in the context of the farm laws, for instance. I mean, it becomes sometimes in as much as my instinct is to let the states determine their future, and because a lot of the large number of people's problems are local problems, right? But there is the other side to it, is that if you got continuously you got a situation of bad local state governments, right, then you begin to worry that what have the people of the state done wrong to deserve bad governance. And so then you feel that, well, perhaps the center has to step in, not outside of the constitutional powers, but within. And farm laws have been a good example of that. That no economist has said that farm laws are bad for the farmers. Actually, quite the contrary. That is one set of reforms on which all economists have been in agreement. For decades. I have written on it easily, for more than 15 years, at least 15 years. It hasn't happened. And initially, actually, the effort was done through the state instrumentality, right? Because agriculture is genuinely seen as a state subject. And so Atal Bihari, Prime Minister Vajpayee sort of started the process by saying that, look, we will write the model APMC law, which is called the Agricultural Produce Marketing Committee's law. And we will persuade the states to adopt these laws. And 17 years, first the Vajpayee government, then the Prime Minister Manmohan Singh's government, then Prime Minister Modi's government, they all tried and all, but some progress happened, but not enough, not fast enough. Then you begin to also feel that, what have the farmers done so wrong? That they ought to have to wait and wait and wait to just get the right to sell their own produce and set the prices of their own produce. Under the system that exists under APMC, farmers are basically at the mercy of the commission agents in these mandis, marketplaces. They have nowhere else to go. I mean, they're not allowed actually. By law, they're required to sell their produce in the mandi through these commission agents. That's wrong. So, which is where I think if you ask me, did the central government do the right thing to step in and do it? Ideally, this should have been actually. Within the federation, agriculture being state subject, ideally it should have been done by the states. But then at some point you do have to come in and say, but this sort of thing can cut both ways, because if the central government also uses its power to make bad laws, of which large numbers got made under Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. A lot of the reforms are all about dismantling what Mrs. Gandhi did. So, she was politically, she was a very savvy prime minister, was very nationalistic. We all, she is one of the most admired prime ministers in India. But on the economic front, she destroyed. And central power got used. Labor also, should be actually a more largely a state. I mean, it's in Indian constitution, it's on the concurrent list. But bad laws got made by the central government. So anyway, that's the sort of tension that is there. But thankfully, in terms of at least some basic devolution of power to the states is there in the constitution, right? Because the tax revenues have to be shared through the instrumentality of the Finance Commission, which is in constitutional body, very independent and all, and it makes its recommendations on how this division will be done of the tax revenues. So that I think is a very good feature which empowers the states because they get a certain amount of revenues on which they can run their state level programs. But in other dimensions, there is always this tension that remains,
Thank you.
We have another question from Anya.
Hi, am I audible?
Yeah.
Right. So my question was, you talked about how India should follow kind of China and kind of transition away from agriculture towards a more manufacturing focused economy. Well, I think some people have also kind of suggested that India focus a lot more on the services sector. So something along the lines of, if China was the factory of the world, then India should be like the office of the world. Do you think that that's like a viable alternative?
Yeah, many people say that, but they're wrong. I'm quite categorical on that, because you got about 200 million farmers. Can you move them into running the world's offices? You can't. I think the skills required are very different. And of course, moving the offices, some movement has happened, but purely on that, if you start thinking of employing, so let's say you need to move 100 million people over a period of 15-20 years. No country will let these offices move in that large numbers. But even if suppose you didn't face that, you still got the problem. How are you going to train? I mean, it takes a generation to train, and given our school education system, which if you look at any of the reports from Pratham, NGO Pratham, brings out these annual reports, ASAR. Fifth graders cannot read at the second grade level. Almost 50-60% of the fifth graders cannot read. With that education system, how are you going to create this? And in any case, why has it not happened, right? I mean, we have been doing this activity for sure since at least the year 2000. I mean, the back offices, the Infosys, Wipros, Tata consultancies, they had already emerged actually by then as providing these back office services. 2 decades have happened. Why hasn't it happened? Right. So you just cannot. I don't think none of them. This is an enticing idea which people put on the table, but never ever I have seen anybody give a proper elaborate plan how this can happen. Can you, I mean, the fundamental question, can you actually bring in the farmers? And in fact, don't forget, even a lot of the urban employment is in these very low level, you go drivers, household servants, the simple mechanics, etc. Can you turn them into tech workers? When you say, back office, it basically requires IT training. Can you train them into IT kind of workers? Answer is no.
Thank you.
I'm just conscious of your time. How many more questions are you willing to answer? Or hello?
Aravand, can you hear us? Hello?
Right.
I'm not sure. Maybe Priyanka's lost connection. Aravand, can you hear us?
No, I see Priyanka there. She's there.
Oh, she's there, but I can't hear her. Maybe that's my problem.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Just conscious of your time. So how many questions are you willing to answer? Or do you want to end?
You're speaking too. You're not loud enough.
I think she was just asking if you could take maybe one or two more questions, or I'll have you
Go ahead.
kind of run by it now.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Priyanka, did you have a direct question? If you don't, I wanted to kind of ask something as well.
So there's one question in the chat, and then you can also ask your question.
Yeah, no, go for it.
So the question in the chat is, do you think India will see a staged rise in the labor-intensive production that was effectively a missing stage, unlike the rapid development of other economies such as China? And do you think this is needed for future economic success?
So I missed the first part. Can you read this again?
So do you think India will see a rise in labor-intensive production like in China?
Okay, that's that's crystal balling it, but I can't say. I think I mean, if we can't do that, then the transition. So ultimately, this transition will have to happen. So the question we are asking really is that, do we want this transition to happen at this Korea, Taiwan, China kind of pace, or we want it to happen at the UK, Europe, United States pace? Those countries took over 100 years for this transformation to happen. These other countries did it over a period of 3 decades or so. If we can't do that, then I think we'll be on a much slower track. It will take maybe another 50 years before we see the kind of transition that China has been able to do, or South Korea has been able to do. So as a result, I've been at the forefront of arguing that this is what the government needs to do. I think there is now a lot of recognition of this fact at all levels, but not enough probably is being done. And particularly, I think, there is also this issue of, I don't know, somehow the bigger entrepreneurs just don't seem to want to do these labor-intensive industries in India. So, I mean, I don't know. Answer, to this, the direct answer to the direct question is I do not know. What I can say is that the transition in terms of time will be an awful longer if the labor-intensive industries cannot emerge.
Okay, thank you for that. Amartya, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, no, I think it was kind of maybe more of a reflective question. I recently read about, I think Reliance and Amazon kind of having some kind of legal disputes around things in India, and almost slightly relates to you talking about kind of opening legislation up a little bit and seeing how that might impact smaller to larger firms. What are kind of the risks of opening up these laws and policies, apart from kind of the political instability we've seen with the farm laws? Is there any other risk?
No. There are no risks. We have opened, as I said, from completely nearly autarkic, completely closed economy. We are today fairly open economy. I mean, I don't want to suggest by any means that we've gone back to what we used to be.
Yeah.
So liberalizing trade is one of the easiest things, and that's what we did the first. I mean, I regard that as one of the very low-hanging fruits. That's not more challenging. I mean, Modi government has done far more challenging reforms than opening up. But it's simply that the government basically believes in import substitution. If the leadership believes in import substitution, then that's what it is doing. But it's not a political The issue is not political, and if they've taken the risk with farm laws, this is nothing.
Great, thank you.
All right.
Sounds great. I don't think we have any more questions from what I can see right now. But no, a big thanks for your time here. I know the audience was a little bit smaller than we kind of expected for this, but I'll make sure to kind of get it uploaded on our channels and promote it through that sense as well. But thank you so much for coming and giving us an insight on your book. And I know some of the people in here, well, I think 90% of us are economists, so we all do quite enjoy listening to your arguments. Okay. But thank you so much, Aravindji. Is that it?
Yeah, no, just thank you again, and we're very grateful that you participated in our event, and we really appreciate your time.
All right, my pleasure, and bye-bye.
Thank you. Take care. Bye, everyone.